Exactly. 10 on the dot. I think it's time to get this started. Wonderful. So thanks everyone for joining us today for already this 5th edition of the Pass the Mic webinar series. We started this close to 1 year ago. Give it a try and see if you like this content. And it kind of became a staple of the ShareGate marketing content and educational content. And since you seem to be liking it, we're keeping on moving with this series. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Pass the Mic series, it's a series where we essentially invite some of our good friends and industry experts to talk about specific topics that interest you in your role in IT, and that has to do with anything with Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Teams. And yeah, and we're really happy to have Richard with us today for this 5th edition. So I'll go ahead and introduce Richard in just a moment. Before we get started, just the regular upkeep. This session will be recorded, and we will send the recording after this event is done. So probably later today or somewhere tomorrow, you should receive the recording of this event. Like we mentioned, go ahead and ask all of your questions. We want to hear about you and your challenges. So don't be shy. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Yeah, or just say hi and tell us where you're joining us from. It's always fun to know where you're joining us from. And yeah, last thing before we get started, there is a big ShareGate event coming up if you already haven't seen. It's called Rise Up, where we will be talking about a lot of interesting stuff that's happening on the ShareGate side. We'll be talking a lot about our roadmap, what's coming, and how we ShareGate wants to help your team kind of get over this kind of like reactive mode and actually be more proactive in yeah, basically helping your organization and maintaining your Microsoft 365 environment so you can concentrate on doing the real valuable work. So if you're interested, make sure to check that out. And with that out of the way, I think let's get started with our presentation. So today we have Richard Harbridge, which is the co-founder of To Lead, a company based out of Toronto. Yeah, so I'll pass it over to Richard. I'll let him introduce himself in more details. And yeah, so enjoy the presentation, everyone. Richard, the floor is yours.
Well, pleasure to be here, and this is an awesome series, so I really do encourage those who haven't kind of watched previous Pass the Mics. I know Susan Hanley did one recently. Susan's a great speaker. Take a look at those if you guys get a chance. So today's session is on future-proofing your Microsoft 365 and Teams provisioning strategy. And provisioning is just a fancy way of saying, how do we create these spaces, these digital spaces like Microsoft Teams, and how do we do it in a more effective way over time? Now, you don't just provision Teams, right? We provision a variety of other solutions and scenarios. Maybe for your particular organization, you're struggling with Power Platform and provisioning Power BI workspaces or other things like that. So depending on where you are in your journey and what challenges you're having, again, don't only ask those questions on the sidebar, but feel free to reach out afterwards, because in a session like this, I can be general with my guidance. I can give you sort of best practices and things like that, but it's really hard to be prescriptive, to meet you where you are in your journey and say, here's what I would do if I was you. And we can do that a lot easier if it's a one-on-one. So I know that this slide says I'm super friendly, but I really, really am. I'd really like to connect with you and talk with you. It's a lot easier, again, to share, examples, scripts, other things like that in that kind of context, much harder in these types of discussions. The reason I particularly wanted to talk about this subject is when I work with customers today, there are some big challenges post-pandemic that customers are running into. And the biggest one that I keep consistently seeing is that these customers have quickly, rapidly deployed Microsoft Teams, and they've created a lot of sprawl. They've created a lot of mess around their Teams environments, and they're trying to make sense of that, rationalize it. And so we'll talk about two patterns today, both how do we, start to manage that sprawl, and also how do we make sure as we move forward, we have a technique and a model that's going to connect and make that a lot easier and lower risk. So that's really what we're talking about today. I hope this is helpful for you guys. Let's start with why managing sprawl matters. Now, I bet most of the people on this call, because you literally joined, in your own time, a Teams provisioning discussion, you probably care a lot about sprawl and you understand the value of managing sprawl. But I thought it'd be useful to give you a bit of ammunition. These slides and these materials, as well as anything else you find online that I've created in the past, they're completely available to you to use yourself internally, or like I said, just bring somebody like me in and have them, us tell managers, leaders, executives, stakeholders, why this matters. So let's start with one of the biggest reasons this matters. Sprawl, again, fundamentally isn't a bad thing, right? Sprawl happens when content grows over time. As we create more digital spaces, those could be SharePoint sites, those could be Microsoft Teams, those could be spaces outside of Microsoft technology completely, right? Facebook communities, things like that. As you create these digital spaces over time, it becomes harder and harder if you're not aware of them, right? If the organization doesn't have an understanding of what are all these spaces, what are they used for, how are they, going to be used, who owns them, what kind of metadata or information do we know about these spaces? Do they relate to products, clients? Do they relate to departments? Those are all things that if we knew about, you would argue that you don't have unmanaged sprawl, you have managed sprawl. So I'll come back to that concept, but the problem with sprawl, almost all the pain points of security risks, data leakage, difficulty managing them, redundancy of sites and spaces, navigation challenges, search challenges, all of these things stem from if we don't understand the spaces and we haven't labeled them and structured them and done certain things around them to enable these kinds of experiences that improve search and things like that, then of course you're going to feel the pain of that sprawl. So again, sprawl is a generally good thing. It denotes adoption. What we want managed sprawl, not unmanaged sprawl. And you might say to yourself, well, the good news here is Microsoft themselves have improved a lot of experiences, and that's true. There's a lot of ways today you can do a search, either like the go-to command or in Teams itself, you can search across Teams. But even in this picture, which is actually from our organization, and we're only around 40 people, and when you do a search in our organization, you see a lot of different spaces that light up. And this is because, in most organizations, especially when you're a couple hundred or 1,000 or 10,000 people, it's very difficult to navigate just the volume of spaces that we have access to. And so this becomes a problem where the out-of-the-box experiences for navigation, maybe for search and a few other things, maybe just don't quite work for our needs. And so we'll talk about how these deficiencies in experience can still be met if we, again, manage sprawl, if we kind of take provisioning on and we optimize things just a little bit. And sometimes what I'm describing doesn't require advanced, customization or things like that. A lot of this can be done with just out-of-the-box components or, very quickly with third parties as well. So that's the first comment. The second one is you can see here a lot of people might say, well, what if the administrators, because if you're IT and you have access to everything in the back end, you have access to those admin centers for Teams and for SharePoint, you can of course go to those and you can see all the spaces. And it's true, you can see things like when it was created, you can see things like, when was the last activity in that space. You can do things like even understand maybe who the original owners were or, who the current, technical owners are of that space. But what you don't have in there is you don't have anything that tells you which products this relates to, what clients this space might relate to. It doesn't tell you things like which department or business unit or practice group or whatever your organizational principles are. It doesn't tell you anything about those. And that's actually really important because if you're IT, you want to proactively support different business needs and you want to target those scenarios. And so it's really, really challenging because someone says, hey, I need support with X, and you have no idea what the space is used for because, again, on the back end, the technical side, there's none of that context provided. And so we'll talk more about how you could potentially enable that with out of the box, but also by extending this with other experiences, again, that are very easy to build yourself with out of the box components or with third parties or custom. The last comment here for sprawl and why it's really problematic with Microsoft 365, Teams, and Microsoft 365 groups by proxy is that when you create these, often you're not just creating a team or just creating, the group. You're creating a number of other potential artifacts, planners. You're creating SharePoint sites. A private channel or a shared channel creates a SharePoint site. So even like sub elements of provisioning within a team can create these extra spaces. And these digital spaces do need to be still managed. managed, right? There's still an understanding of, well, if it's a shared channel, which departments does it relate to, which products does it relate to, et cetera. You still need that kind of context to be able to proactively and predictively manage it. So that's really what we're talking about. Managing sprawl is what we want. In the same way, you can use that same framing as managing provisioning is more optimal than unmanaged provisioning. So yes, you can of course let anyone create a space or site or things like that. But again, if you can track or understand what that space is, or if you can get just a little bit more information about it, then you're moving away from unmanaged provisioning towards managed provisioning. We don't have to delay the user's experience. We don't have to slow things down. We don't have to make it harder for them. We can both improve the experience while also making it more manageable. So if you're interested in some additional reasons for why sprawl needs to be managed, I've put together with our team a big list of things to consider for why sprawl is quite problematic. What are the costs of sprawl? What are the things that could be impacted by sprawl? I won't go through them all right now just for the sake of time, but I'll go through just a couple high-level items, and then I'll show you a resource that you can go download yourself that has all of this in greater detail, so you can kind of take the pieces that matter most to you or that matter most to your organization. So ineffective naming is a really good starting point for sprawl. A lot of times when we name a site or a team, we often use terms like management or operations or general terms. I'm not talking about inappropriate naming. It's just naming that isn't clear about the purpose. It's not clear, again, is this for clients? Is this, management space for a client, for a project, for a department, for some other cross-functional team? It's not clear, so we need to make those clearer. Now you could say, oh well, we'll have this really amazing team naming strategy, but again, that gets really problematic quite quickly because there's just not enough space in the name to provide all these types of attributes and properties, and again, searching for that becomes problematic as well. This is also a problem because often Yammer has official versus unofficial communities, there is no equivalent capability inside of teams. So when you look at teams, you can't tell if this sales site, this team that was created, maybe it's orphaned, it was created at one point and then abandoned because someone realized, oh, we actually already have a sales team, that is not the authoritative one. And so you get a lot of people clicking through and going, oh, this isn't the right one, and getting confused, especially new employees and things like that. So this is quite problematic as well. There's another challenge as well on ineffective naming that kind of spreads into these other patterns, which is when you use certain names, those namespaces are also taken up. And so you can run into challenges where, again, if I've named something because I just got there first, resources or operations or something, and then someone else wants to use that URL, that short link URL model, it can become quite problematic. So there's quite a bit to think about just for naming. And you might think, well, owners, we actually have a solution because each team has owners, right? We can designate owners. And most organizations we talk with, they know they should have at least 2 owners. So yeah, let's have 2 owners. But how do we enforce that? How do we report when that's not true? How do we do things like deal with the fact that what if the owner is just a technical owner, but actually approval for access and things like that should really go through a business sponsor, and there's a designated set of business sponsors or one business sponsor that should be elevating through. What happens if both owners are no longer in the organization or available? What do we do then? Who becomes the next owner? How do we deal with escalations, security reviews, other types of motions we might want to do on that space? And then, of course, there's a big challenge of accountability. One of the biggest reasons for this is because, again, often ownership is a distributed thing. It's not necessarily just the technical people who created the spaces or technically own teams, because they might be more, super users and savvy. It might be, again, other business stakeholders that aren't represented there. And of course, these owners become a problem as well, because if we want to escalate, let's say an owner is non-responsive, if we knew that the space related to a department, we could do that, right? If it's a HR department related project team, if we know those things about it, when the owners aren't responding and we have a security attestation or review cycle or something else that's kind of mandatory or important, we can escalate to the department lead or to someone else because we know that department. So again, owners missing is a more complicated subject as well. And then redundancy is an obvious problem of this, right? Because we have inconsistency across these workspaces. Most of the time, if you have this problem, you haven't templated these spaces. So there's really very little consistency if I go from one team to another. One team might have a sync channel, and that's where we have all our meetings. And that's nice because then it doesn't, conflate or overload the general channel, right, with all those threads and discussions. But maybe another organizational unit or project, or maybe even something very similar, both are projects, but they do a very different information architecture, different channel structure. And that's fine if that's your intention, but for most people, what they want is a better experience from the ground up. Not only that, but in many cases, we see people who create these provision teams, but haven't utilized the template capability. And so there's extra steps manually that almost all team owners constantly do, like linking to different resources. If it's a project site, linking to the project management systems that you're using, and so on and so forth. What if you could simplify and add those tabs, those references? What if you could connect this from an experience perspective for them to improve and streamline that? And how do we do that? We need to know a little bit more about those spaces when they create it, right? Is it a project space? Oh, let me show you the different ways I can pre-configure that to get you going quicker and to improve the experience working across projects and much more. So yeah, this is a problem, and there's lots of ways to resolve it. But at the end of the day, sprawl has a lot of complications and challenges. And the last one, and I don't want to underestimate this, is security risks. With the rise of hybrid and remote or mostly remote work modes, those things are leading to, because organizations are still sort of acting as digital first responders and solving these gaps, there are very real risks of data loss, confusion, accidental sharing, oversharing, things of that nature. And that's much, much more common when an organization is not managing their sprawl. So, and there's very significant costs that are associated with these things. So absolutely all of these are true, right? And there's a lot more of these, right, that we didn't have time to in this particular call to talk about. So please, 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 I would encourage you to take a look at this white paper, which is m365sprawl.com, and it has a further breakdown of a lot of those guidance points. Don't worry, these links will be at the end of the deck as well, and of course in the recording and the slides. So we talked about sprawl. We get it. We should manage it. We have the tools potentially to share why it should be managed. We have ways to communicate to the business to get buy-in. Now the question is how do we actually achieve that? Well, I want to talk about governance just super briefly and make sure that the framing of governance is done the right way. So governance, a lot of times we talk about it from a policy enforcement perspective, a risk mitigation, or sort of an actuarial thing, right? It's like insurance. And I really want to make sure it's clear that governance isn't insurance. Yes, there are policies when you have effective governance. Yes, you have guidance, not just policies. You have enforcement and guidance. You have a bunch of different things like that. But those are really outputs of governance. Governance is really about efficiency. Think of it this way, right? If you have a bunch of younger people, amateurs in a sport playing on a field, they may not have a lot of structure to their play, right? They might just be throwing the ball, catching the ball. If it's football or soccer, they might be running after and just kicking it anytime they get a chance. And so while that's great, they might be the best athletes, for that group. The reality is without those teams or those structures, they're not as effective. And so we know that having teams, having practices, having playbooks, having coaches, and football is a great analogy of this because you have an offensive line versus a defensive line, you have special teams, right? Having these kinds of roles, responsibilities, structures, guidance, guidance being like, here's, the optimal pathways and ways to work, playbooks maybe actually being sort of semi-enforced policies. These are things that make your best talent effective. You could literally have the best talent across all of the NFL, as an example today, and then if you literally didn't have playbooks or any of these things, you wouldn't win, right? You wouldn't be the highest performing. And so in this way, what you're really saying is by investing in provisioning and managing sprawl and governance, what we're really doing is we're maximizing the investment in our people. We're getting the most out of the amazing talent we already have in our organization. And typically reframing governance in this way, where it's supportive, it's to maximize, it's to get, to help us achieve more together, to be our best selves and to perform as best we can. That's definitely a much more positive framing, and it leads to a much more actionable approach, because now we're talking about tactics. We're talking about what can we do to improve governance from where we are today. So yeah, definitely the right kind of analogy and approach to governance. And I just wanted to leave you guys with that. Another way to think about it is the policies and the risk focused stuff. That's because it's an output of good governance, right? The coordinating, the analyzing, the planning is where that happens. And I can prove this. I have hundreds of customers I've worked with over the years. Our organization has done a lot of these governance engagements. And when you do them, almost always, if you just get, operational leaders in a room, you get support leaders in a room, you get development leaders in a room, they will come up with these policies and guidance. They know these problem areas need to be resolved. And so again, half of the effort is really just making the time for it, prioritizing it, and putting some maybe some support around it from an organizational perspective. So let's say we have governance, we've taken the right approach with it, and we also have an understanding of the managing sprawl. So let's talk about tactically what to do. The first comment I'd have is, of course, you could just use the out-of-the-box experience. Now, the out-of-the-box experience works, I think, quite well for smaller organizations. The reason it's okay is because smaller organizations have a footprint, right, a number of sites or spaces, teams, that is small enough that it is potentially possible for a owner or a set of owners within IT to understand what those spaces are about, right? It's a small enough org that I can just reach out and I normally can get an answer, right? There's that kind of reduced friction and accessibility. But as you scale, both in the number of employees and more importantly, the number of spaces, this becomes very, very, very challenging, except with huge cost of ownership for IT to be able to manage and understand. So fundamentally, what are the problems then with this provisioning process? Well, out of the box, it does some things really nice. It says, hey, when you create a site or when you create a team, what are the types of teams and sites you want to create? So the first note that we need to do is, do end users understand those options? And the truth is, most of the time they do not. So we need to both ourselves guide and support that. And this is another reason why many customers may adjust the provisioning process to their own mechanism, because then they can really simplify, this jargon and this language and these types of options. Because creating a team is very different than creating a site, which is very different than creating a Yammer community, and so on and so forth. So if we can create some consistency or simplify that, that might help end users. In addition to that, when you provision these spaces, well, it does ask questions, both in the Teams experience and in SharePoint. When you create these spaces, it asks questions. It doesn't allow you to necessarily add your own questions to this, right? It may even have light classification where you do basic classification, but it doesn't say like which department does this relate to. It doesn't say what's the purpose of this space. Tell me more about that. It doesn't say, hey, you only added one owner, add a second owner, right? Those types of things. And so that's the kind of experience where, again, it's great, it's necessary to understand these out-of-the-box experiences, but in many cases they may not be sufficient. So what's another thing that Microsoft has done to improve templating and post provisioning? So once you've created one of these spaces, the Microsoft approach generally today is, okay, you've created that space, now you can apply a template, you can apply a look and feel, you can apply a structure. In Teams, this is not as advanced in terms of applying a template after it's created, but in SharePoint, it's come a little bit further. And so I wanted to use SharePoint as this analogy because when we post after creation, we can do things like apply a template to add libraries, to create an information architecture space, set up, configure pages, do all sorts of things that you might want to do in a common template. And again, this is really, in theory, a great complement to an effective provisioning process, because if we template our provisioning in the first place, then we can have that great starting point, and then people could always update or modify or tweak it with additional templates after the fact. And that's probably a better use case for these types of technology improvements, again, unless you're a very small organization. The other challenge with these templates historically is it can be difficult to unpack which templates were applied, in what order, and things like that. That's also something that Microsoft has improved. So again, does Microsoft have some great tools out of the box? This is improving, absolutely. But at the end of the day, the questions that we are missing are things like purpose, department, product relationship, all these other things that will help us both navigate, understand the content of the space, and much more. Another thing to understand is that templating capability that Microsoft has out of the box does have some limitations that you need to use Power Automate or code for. So if on the left side, if there's anything you wanted to do, like via the templating process that's not represented on the left, you would have to do that with Power Automate or code or some other solution. And so this is also one of the challenges that we run into a lot of times, because yes, these are great for templating, but a lot of times what people want is something a little bit more advanced, configurable, predefined for them, that requires a scenario that you can't quite do here. So like advanced default metadata, or applying label strategies on content, and having sort of remote receivers that check on that regularly. There's all sorts of patterns that organizations want to tackle, and again, it can be difficult if we haven't managed provisioning or supported it from the beginning. Metadata, I've mentioned a few times, is really critical, and really I think if there's one pain point in provisioning today, it's that metadata isn't captured on creation. So when you create a space, if we had the ability to ask what division does this relate to, what product, what project, we could potentially template it for them. We could potentially, improve the adoption, because we could say, oh, you created this type of space. Let me show you how to use it. Like here's targeted guidance and training. Here's, it's the first time you've created a space. Hey, we're registering that, right? First time you created a space. Let me give you particular support. So those are things that we can do when we are a part of that provisioning process, especially when we have this kind of data, right? It allows us to target that and improve it. But without that, it becomes quite problematic. Now, one of the biggest reasons the metadata is so important is if you've ever used the labeling capabilities of Microsoft 365, sensitivity, retention, et cetera, you'll know that you have to apply that to the content, right? Not just the collection, but the content within it needs to be protected in certain ways. And so that becomes problematic, because the approach that you have sort of out of the box is you can choose like a targeted URL, so this particular site gets it. But what you want is like by content type, by, if the metadata is X, then let's apply that. So if we ask something like, hey, does this relate to HR? And someone says, yes, it's an HR project site. If we have that information, now we could have a policy approach where we say, okay, all content in these HR spaces has a default metadata of, department equals HR. Now we can apply a label or other techniques based on that metadata that is available on all content, not just documents, by the way. Like default metadata works even for like news, events, a variety of other content sources within a space. And the other reason that this can be really helpful is it helps reduce redundancy, because think about it like this. When you create that space, what if I did something really simple, really simple, and I just notified the department if you create a departmental space? So you create a new HR space, and all I do is notify a department lead or a team and say, hey, just FYI, there's a new Microsoft team for your department that was created. Here's the information about it. Here's the contact. What ends up happening in that instance is it means that in many instances we've seen, IT doesn't need to get involved in reducing redundancy. That department or that business unit actually does it for them. So they essentially connect and go, oh, I didn't know you're creating, employee files. Why are you creating an employee files team? We actually have that over here. It's a private channel of this team, and that's how we've been using it before. Oh, I didn't know that. So now we've reduced redundancy, right? Now that that's done, they can make a request or even delete it themselves. There's different options there, but now we have a pathway forward that reduced that redundancy and improved it. That example, all that was missing is metadata. If we had the information like the department, we can notify people, and then that can lead to way more visibility and catching of these kinds of mistakes and issues before they become problematic. And it's a really easy win for you to potentially provide that. The way you provision these spaces, if you want to go away from this sort of out-of-the-box experience, is you can essentially build your own forms. So there's actually a really great example, in my opinion, for this in the GitHub repos today. So these are sort of free community-built solutions. One that's essentially a request a team function. And again, I don't think this should be used in production, just to be clear. What it is it's a good idea to show you how you could think about the team's provisioning in a different way. Things like being able to clone previous requests, right, or copy a previous request. That's a really powerful feature, something you can provide people. So yes, you're not using the out-of-the-box experience to provision, but hey, if you've provisioned a space before and you kind of did all the work, you can start from there and then edit it, right? Edit the fields that need to be changed, etc. Or what if we wanted to do things like apply additional membership things, like where we wanted to, one of the very common things you do is when you create a space, you want to ensure or automatically apply certain members of that space, from an organizational support perspective, things like that. Again, maybe there's a rule for departmental projects that they always, if it's related to a department, that should have these people from that department have access to those projects. And so you can make that really clear, and then you can always give them people exception options. So you can customize these kinds of creation experiences when you modify them, when you create them, or when you use third parties that enable that. So this is not something that needs to be inaccessible. You can try it yourself. You can just go install this, play with it yourself to see. It actually does provision, if you set it up correctly, to provision teams for you, based on templates and other things like that. But again, it's more of a starting point for you to build this yourself if you want to. Now, we have customers who've built hundreds of different experiences. Some, like in the intranet or digital hub, they'll have like slide outs where, I click a create team or create site or create workspace, and then it gives me all sorts of different options and templates and things like that. You can do that with SPFX. You can do that with, custom controls. You can do it with an out-of-the-box list. Everything I just described, you could just have a SharePoint or Microsoft list. You say, okay, you're making a new request for a space. Fill these things out. We will go create that space for you. You could literally have a Power Automate after that space has been requested based on approval or not. Maybe whitelist some people and they automatically create it, but then you can automatically create the templates, the spaces, and everything else on the back end. So all of the scenarios I'm describing could be done with just out-of-the-box functionality. It doesn't require, Visual Studio Code skills, things of that nature. And if you're looking for more ideas, these are the common ways we've seen people do it. They've used Logic Apps, Web Jobs, Azure Functions. There's a wonderful set of tools in something called Patterns and Practices, PNP. There's a provisioning engine experience that Microsoft has. It's sort of what the site designs or site templating capability that they have today, Teams templating, is based on. So it uses that, has a little bit more code capability there. And then, of course, ShareGate, who we're talking about today, has wonderful ways to both handle the post-provisioning process, like I mentioned earlier, with like the post-provisioning, hey, give me this metadata, as well as the provisioning process itself. So one of the biggest things is a relatively new announcement in the last little while from ShareGate, in that they have this wonderful provisioning feature. Laurent or team, would you guys like to share a little bit about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak a bit to that. Well, yeah, like you mentioned, it's brand new. So we've been working on a provisioning feature in ShareGate. Obviously, we want to be there for our customers through the whole life cycle of their Microsoft 365 and Teams. And obviously, like you mentioned, like provisioning is the first step, and doing it right from the beginning is really important. So yeah, basically we want to really focus on creating a frictionless provisioning process, and kind of like filling the gaps also that maybe the out-of-the-box solutions might have. So a bit more flexibility, and really helping you kind of guide your users use the right tools, right? So I know you mentioned that, Richard. It's important that people understand what they're creating, and what those questions are and what the implications are, and really kind of like helping them throughout that whole process. And obviously it ties into the rest of the ShareGate functionalities. So if you say, for instance, that you want a minimum of 2 or maybe 3 owners associated to this, to a specific team or template that you want to create, well, then it's going to be automatically, it's going to tell you if that team doesn't respect that. So you can take action automatically on that and empower the owners to address the situation. So yeah, in a nutshell, go check it out. It's brand new if you're interested. But yeah, pretty awesome. Excited for this this big piece that's been added recently.
Awesome. And so again, if you already are a customer of ShareGate, this is a great opportunity. And if you're not, something to consider is how the third-party ecosystem supports. Again, a lot of stuff already in ShareGate provides support for like post-provisioning, management, those types of things. Here we have a connection of that whole experience. So let's talk about that post-provisioning ask, and this is an example actually from ShareGate on the right. But again, of course, after you create the site, you could, through manual methods, we could do something like, oh, let's reach out to different, owners. Okay, like we notify IT, or maybe just IT, on a regular basis, weekly, monthly, whatever. They look at, oh, what are the new sites that are created? They message people and they say, hey, you're a business owner, you're the creator of the site. please tell me more about it. Fill this form out. Let me know more. You could do that. The challenge that we found is that, well, if you make this more streamlined, more seamless, like IMing, like in this example, you're going to get a much better result. So let me be clear. The simpler you can make it, like just tell me this thing, make it easy for people to share that information, you will get better results. So again, I really do like the way ShareGate does this, but it is harder sometimes to get that information without, the stick, right? You can only carrot it so much before you can get that. So capturing it earlier is always a little bit more optimal from an industry perspective than capturing it after. However, all of us have tons of teams, and those teams are unmanaged today, right? And meaning that we don't know, what department they relate to. We don't know certain information about them. So what we can do is two things. One, when you're doing a migration project, so a lot of customers today are migrating from previous legacy versions of SharePoint. SharePoint 2013 is, expiring for end of extended life support, et cetera, in early April next year. So think about that. Like if you're transitioning from a SharePoint server environment or even a tenant to tenant, you have an acquisition, you're moving, sites across, teams across. When you do those kinds of scenarios, you actually are assessing this anyways. In almost every instance, we have to figure out who's going to validate, right? Who's going to check that the site's done correct. We want to think, how do we stage this, right? And most of the time when we migrate, we do staging, right? So we say, okay, this group, which is this department, we're going to migrate all their content, and then they're going to let us know, and then they'll be done, right? They'll be fully migrated and transferred across. And then we'll do this department, or we'll do, by client or project or, product and so on and so forth. So this metadata is actually captured very frequently in these migration projects, which of course ShareGate has great tooling, by the way, for. And if we capture that metadata anyways from business users and things like that, let's just keep it, right? Let's use that metadata after the migration, all that hard work. Let's benefit from that in the longevity. And if you didn't do that, you're already migrated or you have this mess, that's okay too. It's still extremely worthwhile to inspect that space, to do identification for these light, pieces of metadata, even if it's guesswork. One of the things I do encourage people to do is put the wrong information, right? You just say, I think it's this, and then you just send it to somebody else. And then if it's not correct, they might go, oh, that's not correct, and they'll fix it. Whereas if it's blank, maybe we won't contribute to it. And then lastly, we'll come back to it, but directory experiences and other things that make it visible that you don't have that information can go a really long way. So essentially saying like, hey, I'm on the HR page and I scroll down to see all of the HR related spaces, and I say, why isn't my space there in sort of a directory experience or something like that? All of a sudden, that's a really clean and easy discussion of, oh, you didn't tell us that your space related to HR. Tell us that, and they will automatically light up not just here, but in a variety of other experiences. So again, there's lots of ways to create that visibility. Now, I mentioned earlier, out-of-the-box experiences are improving. So the site template history is one of my favorite things that have come out recently. But again, even in the Microsoft Teams space, this is one of those things that does change quite a bit. There's better. I like that we can finally, wasn't that long ago, August of 2022, we could finally get the template data from Graph API. So there's a lot of things where Microsoft is still working their way to making this a little bit easier for us. And again, this is where leaning on either the community, on a third party, or on service provider like Toollead or somebody who can help you is not a bad idea. And when you're navigating this space, especially because they might have visibility on what's coming that's not public in this roadmap. Last comment, every time we create and change something like the provisioning form or the request process, we have to understand that there are multiple stages and steps to most of these that we need to think through. So today, if someone creates a team, there may not be any approval. Maybe you want to create that for a subset of people, not for everyone. Maybe you kind of whitelist, you auto approve for some people who've done training or done other things, but maybe you don't do it for another classification. So these are things that you can explore yourself. You could do things like, hey, it's your first time creating a space. Maybe that has an extra step of approval, even if it's just an approval to notify to coach, to provide an opportunity for IT or that business unit, that department. Remember, we know things about the space to be able to say, hey, there's champions, stakeholders, other people that might be able to coach you. Let's make that connection, and then we'll create that space for you. Lots of ways to potentially improve that experience. It's up to you how you want to design these processes, but every one of these processes always has three things in them. They always have some sort of approval acceptance piece most of the time that people create, whether that's post-creation or after, because you're an owner, that means you have accountable responsibilities. Another one that's really common is how do we deal with information management? That's what IM means here, information management policies, classifications for information, sensitivity, other things like that. We have to have that somehow represented in this request process with hopefully clear understanding for a layman or someone who doesn't understand these technical terms, what these things mean. And then lastly, almost always they have some sort of registry or, again, maybe a directory that enables people to consume and manage these spaces after the fact. Very important for IT, because if I have this registry or directory of all the digital spaces we've created, I can do things like automate security reviews with Power Automate. I can do things like just literally manage that and say, was this inspected? When was the last time we checked the owners of this? You could have things like, from an IT perspective, management wise, you could do things like track, is this a classic experience versus a modern experience? Some of these things are in the out of the box admin tools, but you can aggregate it all so it's more clear. And so that can be a really powerful thing. And when you have this registry, it's potentially quite easy for you to expose it, or a version of it, or a copy of it. There's lots of ways to do this to end users. And again, I brought up an example earlier where I'm, looking at the HR site, the landing page for Intranet for HR, and I want to see the related HR spaces, but I don't see something. Oh, why is that? So having these directory experiences, especially when they're more public, is better. Now, the first comment I just want to note here on public is I hear a lot of customers who say, wait, we have like confidential teams. The names of the teams are confidential and stuff. And I say, no, literally, that is a super bad practice. Don't do that, because when I share my screen, or you share your screen, or other people do many, many ways that they take screenshots and share, team names show up all the time. They show up in SharePoint web parts, they show up in Teams, they show up in a variety of experiences that are very common in Outlook, when you look at the groups names on the left, when someone has their email open. So unless someone's really careful when they do sharing, you can expose the name of a team very easily, especially if it's confidential. So 100% of teams should never have anything confidential in their name. Use code names, do whatever, but it should never have that. Now, if you have that as a starting point, then having it public by default is not a concern. The second, public that it exists and who has access. The second thing is Microsoft already has a ton of built-in capabilities. So if you try and access something you don't have access to, it has a process for you to request that access. So this means that exposing it means that there's a pathway for anyone to be, oh, I don't know about that space. What is that? I can request access to it. And this is really important because the cost of ownership for IT is something we want to reduce. And if we expose the nature of the digital spaces that we have in our organization, allow people to discover them, to filter, to navigate them, then they can do things like go, oh, I'm going to create this space, this project for HR for employee files, the one I mentioned earlier. They might be able to catch that earlier, right? Because they might know that exists and might have requested access to it or done a variety of other things. In fact, in the provisioning process, in that form, right, that form that maybe we build, in that provisioning process, a really common thing to do is as people fill out metadata, as they provide information about the space they're trying to create, maybe we keep filtering a list of all the available digital spaces on the right. And so what happens is as you fill that out, you're actually seeing a smaller subset, and then eventually you might go, wait a second, there are a couple project sites for HR, right? That are project sites, type is project, department equals HR. I see them on the right. Oh, these ones, maybe this isn't this exact space, but I should check. So you have like the contact, the reach out, the whatever next steps are on the right in that little grid. And then when they click on those people, again, what we found when we do these kinds of experiences is you often see people drop off the provisioning, right? Because they realize, oh, I don't need to create the space. And if they don't come back and create that space later, then we've proven, right, that essentially we've reduced redundancy before it even started. And so that's a really common thing you can do, when you have these directory experiences. So there's lots of value in these directory experiences, a really important element. And if you've already created a registry, exposing a version of it or a variant or a representation of an out-of-the-box list, again, this can all be done with out-of-the-box features like lists and stuff like that, is not a bad idea to start. This particular visual example is for a page where we have a view of a subset of these digital spaces, these ones that are type equals community, and then there's specific metadata around communities that are represented. This is for a law firm. All right, so section 4. So we're talking about lifecycle and governance opportunities. So we've figured out that we need to manage sprawl. We've got, an efficiency-oriented governance approach. We actually have managed provisioning where we create spaces, we ask these questions, we understand the value of metadata. We even do some stuff after they're created to just get a little bit of extra metadata or validate that metadata on a regular basis. Again, things that ShareGate does well. So things like that we can do. So now the question becomes, what else can we do? And this is that last example where you could do things like, oh, is this metadata still up to date? Or how do we use this metadata after it's created? That is really where the improved management originates from. What can we do if we have information about that space? So I talked about duplication detection and reduction in provisioning. In post-provisioning, an example of that was when I notified that department lead, right? When I notified department HR, hey, there's this new space. Expiration and archiving policies, well, we want to archive spaces, right? A lot of times we have content that is time sensitive. It's like, chronological relevance. And then after a period of time, it's no longer relevant. That doesn't mean we want it to be gone forever. It might just mean it needs to move somewhere. It needs to be maybe removed from the core index. Maybe it needs to be shifted to like different types of search experiences. Maybe we want to have multi-stage archiving where it actually truly is archiving and then deleting it and getting rid of it for security and liability reasons, from a legal perspective. Lots of reasons to do these things. Some customers expect you to delete the data within a certain time frame. It's actually really common now, if you're working with different parties. So, expiration and archiving policies need to be enforced. To do this out of the box is really challenging because out of the box, there's only a few options you have available to you, right? Out of the box, you can go manually, right, to a team and you can click it and you can archive it. What that does, right, is it sets it to read only. It's not really doing maybe what you wanted it to do, which is to move it to another location or to like go through a multi-disposition process to eventually delete it. And so this is an important distinction that the out-of-the-box experience, it does have, some capabilities here you should be aware of, but they may not meet your needs. Another example of this sort of idea is where you can use it to provide automated guidance, adoption, or target particular risks. So here's an example. I wanted to show one. This is using Power Automate, and it's just an out-of-the-box list. This customer uses an out-of-the-box list on the back end. And so you can see here what we're doing is we essentially are reducing redundant spaces and things like that, and a few other things. What we're doing is the compliance action, right, that we're saying, this is an IT-led motion, is you're missing an owner. So I have one owner, I don't have two. And so I need you to fill this out. What we've done here is instead of them going and putting an owner in Teams, because they may not know how to do that. I know that it sounds like, oh, everyone knows how to add a team owner. Not a lot of end users have ever been trained in Teams. They may not know how to do that. So we might even make it easy. If you want to do it out of the box, here's guidance on how to do it. If you want help, if you just fill out this form, we will do it for you. What does that form do? It's just a Power Automate that goes and adds the owner, maybe based on an approval or other actions follow up. So that's something that we can do there. So that's an example of the compliance action. On the other side of it, we might be suggesting things, recommending things. So one of my favorite things that we've seen lots of times is customers, internal customers don't know, right, when they have these digital spaces, how they can view their analytics. So you own a Yammer community, but you've never looked at the community analytics. You own a SharePoint site, but you've never looked at, site usage and figured out like, oh, who is using it, when they're using it. You don't even know that individual documents, right, have usage stats. So we can use this as a great opportunity to say like, hey, for your space, here's the link, right, to that analytics page, because these pages have a specific URL pattern. So it's really easy for us to provide that. Or you can make it a little bit more advanced. In this example, what we do is we look at the channels and we see, hey, you have 3 private channels. We've denoted that there's 3. And again, many times historically, if you've had private channels from the beginning, people could have created private channels without the owner of the team being included in them. That's a historic capability that used to be there. And so if you had something like that, you might want to potentially make sure the owner knows you're responsible for these channels, but you don't have access to them, right? So maybe there's a discussion there. Or below that, we have things like, hey, you've told us that this site has highly confidential information, right? That's the case. But you do have external users. That might be fine, but can you check those external users that they're the right people, they should still have access, right? So softer things. You might have that be a compliance motion later, right? If they haven't given you validation or there's some action there, but again, different ideas. And then lastly, you can even suggest different things like we have a holospace or a metaverse, and we want to introduce you into a private preview for things because we think that might be helpful for you and much more. So again, adoption and other things can be targeted because we know more about these spaces in those scenarios. And lastly, of course, third parties make all of this a lot easier. There's capabilities for reviews. One of my favorite capabilities for ShareGate is this sort of review cycle for security, like, these are the guest links, things like that I mentioned, but also things like inactive detection. Hey, we've noticed that your group or team or whatever has been inactive for a period of time. Or, again, the gap of security on external sharing especially is a bit limited with the out-of-the-box tooling. So what if we can make that easier for people to validate and check? And this is, again, the biggest security risk data leakage wise today with remote and hybrid work and just the increased volume, variety, and velocity, right, of collaboration. And then, of course, sensitivity tags are super important. Sensitivity tags are how we essentially figure out how we apply the label strategy, if you're using out-of-the-box Microsoft 365 labels, to the content within those spaces. Very, very important for information management, for retention and lifecycle, for a variety of other instances. So making sure that we understand, about what is this type of space and what else do we know about it can be very helpful. Keeping in mind that just knowing that it's a highly confidential space doesn't give you maybe all you need, but knowing that it's an HR-related highly confidential space might give you a lot more, targeting capability for your information management policies. So now we've talked about, okay, we've got lots of ideas on how to manage it. Now that we have these registries, these directories, we have, this provisioning process. What else can we do on the experience side? And so I wanted to kind of take a deep dive into directory experiences because I think this is one that people underestimate the value of. And I can tell you from experience, many customers, the thing that drives people to actually fill out that metadata, unfortunately, isn't the templating. It's not, all those other carrots. It's the directory experience because it's there on display for everyone that your experience is missing data. And my favorite reason to use this, just to be clear, is if you have that migration scenario I just mentioned, you have all this content in your environment and you don't have this information, which is pretty much most of us on this call, right? You don't know which department it relates to, et cetera, for those, 5,000 sites you have, these 5,000 teams. You can just make that public. Like, hey, these ones have metadata, these ones don't. And if you do that, some will be easy to discover. You can filter, you can search, others won't be, and that's fine. It actually means that it won't roll up on those home pages and departmental landing pages and other, strategic sort of dashboard-like experiences where you're rolling this stuff up. And the more you expose that, the more people start to use these types of tools, which will be, they're quite highly adopted. Because again, the out-of-the-box experience for navigation has deficiencies, which we'll talk about, the more you get that benefit. So again, directories are a really, really powerful way to drive not just adoption of, these provisioning processes and things like that, but specifically to provide the data that we need to do the management and proactive approach that we want. So content grew over time. We mentioned this. We also mentioned that navigation out of the box is problematic, both in SharePoint and Teams. And so you could say, okay, well, what are the tools we have? Well, you should have a digital hub for your digital workplace. That's probably SharePoint or Viva Connections being presented as an intranet experience. Most intranets today have beautiful mega menus. You can do this out of the box, or you can build a custom mega menu. When you have a beautiful mega menu, you can start to solve this problem because you could potentially put hundreds of links across multiple categories, and then that can allow people to find it. But as we know, you might have thousands of spaces. So this doesn't really scale to our needs. You could say, well, we can just build a better menu. So yeah, the out-of-the-box menu allows for some scale, but we can build our own mega menus. We can use a left to right analogy, right? You can see here, design aesthetically, we have left to right, which allows for much deeper nesting of links. We can have 4 levels of links. This is a real thing. Lots of customers do, by the way. And when you do that, you could potentially provide, maybe 20% of the footprint of those key digital spaces represented in your nav. A great idea, because the number one use case of intranets, over 82% of people who come to the internet come to it to navigate, right? That's what they use the internet for, is to navigate to things. So if we can invest in navigation, that's not a bad idea. Use iconography, right? We can do lots of things to improve nav. But even then, it's not sufficient to meet the task and the need of sprawl management and navigating that sprawl. Well, what about dynamic navigation? So a great example of this is in the SharePoint home or in a variety of other experiences like the app bar, where you can see things like the sites you're following or recent sites or frequent sites being the popular and recent sites. So there's things like that we can do. But, do you have that really for Teams? Like, do you have those kinds of experiences that work across these other digital spaces? No. And another problem with this is, even if you have this capability, let's say you're using the latest and greatest capabilities, hey, we knew SharePoint existed, but now we're actually using the app launcher. We're using, its full capabilities for being able to navigate to those followed sites, as an example here. In fact, we're using Viva Connections. So Viva Connections enables us to have an experience inside of Microsoft Teams mobile app where I can do things like see my sites again, my Yammer communities, again, a mixture of digital spaces. But even when we have the scenarios like that, it still isn't quite what we need because, again, I can't filter. I can't quickly say, well, show me all the project-related recent sites. Show me the most frequent project sites I was visiting. Show me the digital spaces outside of Microsoft technologies and other things like that. So it's important to understand Microsoft's improving this, but they're not creating a digital workplace directory, right? That's up to you as an organization. It's not on their radar in the near term. It's not something they're going to do soon. They have lots of work to do just for the personalization nav. That's their focus, right? Your sites, your teams, your Yammer communities, and then your storyline spaces, the ones you follow. There's so many things Microsoft still has to do to improve navigation in dynamic ways for key spaces, to improve sprawl management for you personally, and that should be their priority because no one else can do that like Microsoft can, because they have the graph data and they have analytics and algorithms that enable them to do things that partners and other people can't. So in that regard, again, it's great that there's these improvements, but there's still this major gap, which is how the heck do we navigate these spaces when we're looking to understand what are the spaces that exist. We're trying to figure out where should we have access, where do we have access, all sorts of patterns like that. And that's where directory experiences still matter. You could argue the same thing, everything I just described, you could argue for any directory experience. An app directory is an important experience, right? Because a lot of times in organizations, we have solutions, Power Platform apps, all sorts of things all throughout the organization, but often it can be hard to figure out who owns those, where are they, which departments do they relate to? All these things we just mentioned about sprawl management for something like SharePoint spaces and Teams absolutely applies to apps, right? And so there are gaps, right? Not just in Microsoft's platform, but because what metadata matters to you as an organization. Microsoft can't know for every domain, every industry, what metadata you want to collect, what you're going to action, how you're going to use it. That's, again, something that is really dependent on your organization. So you should do that. Why? Because directory experiences are really easy to build. Literally, you can use an out-of-the-box list. We already have the provisioning engine piece, right? So we have something that's creating new items in that list. We already have, it's really easy to discover all existing spaces and essentially import them into the list. If you need help with that, reach out to me. I can give you some code for it. You can use ShareGate, to help with that discovery. You can essentially capture that information and then put it in this directory and say, this is the reality. When someone says, well, is this helpful? It's got all these empty spaces. We don't know those answers. At least, even if it's not fully deployed to every end user, it's very clear to IT, to key business stakeholders, this is a gap, right? We need to solve this gap. So even just exposing that can be really helpful as a strategy. And of course, thus far, I've talked about out-of-the-box directory experiences. ShareGate themselves, will continue to evolve and improve experiences. If we see an example here, this is an example of an SPFX control. So like someone who built a custom one, we've built many of these. And so in this example, the reason you might do that is the out-of-the-box list means that you often have a registry, right, where you have all this extra metadata for IT, like when was the last security attestation, maybe stuff you don't want, to be exposed, right? It's very confidential, but there's not a column level security, right, within SharePoint. So what we can do is we could potentially have a directory list and a registry list. And so we, now we have to deal with sync. If someone updates a directory space, like how do we sync across those? How do we handle that? So this becomes quite problematic. So some customers, what they want to do is expose the directory, and they'll do it through like an SPFX control, like a web part or something like that, just because it provides, an experience that you can completely tailor. So of course, with conditional highlighting, you could do this with a list, but here you see examples of spotlighting, or we can include data sets that aren't included at all in Microsoft. Like this one is a SharePoint server environment, right? We see a SharePoint server site showing up. It's actually a classic site, but from SharePoint server. Another example could be showing Confluence spaces or Jira, Jive, whatever, like things that exist in your organization that are still digital spaces. For now, maybe they're all consolidating Slack, et cetera, into Teams. But until those things happen, you should still make sure that there's a way to navigate to those spaces. Again, a great way to also visibly see the chaos, right, of your environment and system. Now, if that wasn't enough and you're like, oh, I got to watch the recording, you also have some homework. So we created a checklist that's available for free here. I'll pull it across. And essentially within this provisioning checklist, you can see a breakdown of like very common things that you should do when you're determining your teams. Now, the screenshots I included on purpose within the deck were SharePoint related, but the ones here explain how it works within the team's environment. So like I said, there's 5 ways to create a team. There's from scratch, there's existing templates. You know, when you do it from a template, there's different things that it provides on the back end. If you haven't looked at this, by the way, there's some really great improvements Microsoft's made in templating. So again, just a really great resource to get started with your own provisioning. And then if you're looking for a little bit more, I will encourage, again, that sprawl ebook is very helpful. But we also have like an employee experience white paper that's releasing. I think it's technically released quietly. You guys can be secretly aware of it, but on our website, we also have like SharePoint migrations. We've mentioned migrations, so we have a whole white paper on that and how to help with that. Of course, ShareGate themselves have an incredible amount of information available for you as well. And the Rise Up event is coming in October 4th, so be sure to attend that. Ben is an awesome speaker, and it's wonderful to kind of get a sense of what's changing. So with that, I'll wrap up and transition to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard. There's a lot of stuff in there. So before we move to the questions, I want to mention like we will be sharing the slides afterwards. I think, Richard, you also even shared them on social media already, if I'm not mistaken, on LinkedIn.
That's right. Yeah. So
right.
if you go to my LinkedIn or the slide share, again, I think I posted an announcement in the Q&A for those who are in the meeting right now live instead of the recording, but definitely reach out. You'll be able to see them. If you want the PowerPoints, just message me. I'm happy to provide all, the hundreds of slides that we hid as well, right, for the sake of time, anything that helps. Yeah.
There's so much you can talk about in 1 hour, right?
Yeah.
All right, wonderful. So we have a few interesting questions. If you have other questions, now's the time. We're a little bit over time, so if you have to leave, we'll also make sure to send the Q&A in the recording. Yeah, we're going to move to questions right now. So we have a few longer questions, but I think they're still very interesting. So we have an anonymous attendee who asks, we are using dynamic Office 365 groups to provision access specific teams. Is there a way to provide access to the files on the team site to different dynamic Office 365 groups? For example, members of legal department use the legal team for drafting documents, but we want those in the finance department to have access to the legal files from the team site.
I love it. So this feature called Dynamic Memberships is awesome. It's an Azure AD capability where if you have a premium plan, again, there's a dependency here for premium plans. You can essentially have, which is, by the way, in many like M Suite licenses and stuff. So you might already have it. It allows you to say like, okay, if my department equals HR, give me access, automatically add me to this membership, right? Things like that. And so really, really great feature. Most time people have done it for years, especially in legal, actually, through custom code and things like that. Now we have it built in. Now this feature essentially works anytime you use a group membership. So yes, when you create like a team, you can say, okay, this team has this group membership, and that's how we're going to use dynamic memberships. You can also, in the SharePoint side, apply technically to any individual item that can have permissions. You can apply your own permission, break inheritance, your own permissions to that. And when you do that, you can apply a group. That could be an Azure AD group as an example, or these Microsoft 365 groups, or a variety of things. And of course, some of those can be dynamic membership based groups. So you can do that today, and it does function. Where one of the risk areas that I see a lot is when people deal with like ethical walls in legal specifically, which is this idea like, okay, this is a matter, you can work on it, but I can't automatically give you that dynamic membership unless these conditions are met. Like you couldn't have worked on this type of thing before. If that's where you're going with this question, just because it was come from the legal perspective, that's a little bit different. You use like information barriers and a number of other capabilities, again, with different licensing expectations that Microsoft's built. So that's another pathway that might complement your strategy. But generally speaking, speaking, my biggest concern with that kind of technique we've just described is it's not always obvious to people when they look at those spaces how that works. A perfect example of this, Microsoft 365 groups, if you're in SharePoint and you click on the name of the group, it shows you who the members of that group are. You can see that as an end user. AD groups, like Azure AD groups or AD groups that have been synced, et cetera, security groups, et cetera, they don't provide that experience today. In 2023, I want to say like November, don't quote me on this, it's in the roadmap. There is, go look up the roadmap for Azure AD groups or something. There is this thing Microsoft's working on the admin side for both dynamic memberships and that visibility and some other things like that. So there's a specific roadmap item in my mind that I want to reference that's public. So Microsoft is aware of things they can do to improve these experiences with dynamic memberships, but it's pretty far away. It's late 2023, I think, when that goes GA. In mid 2023, I think, when it goes for public, preview or whatever. So do note that some of these things are where a third party who solves that problem might be worth expending effort, or creating like a simple customization for now might be something worth doing to automate or programmatically handle it.
Wonderful. Thanks for the detailed answer. Gonna move on to the next question. Marcel asks us, is there a way to use native Microsoft tools, not ShareGate, to get a list of all shareable links that have been created and are in use, both internal users and guest users? Furthermore, is there a way to easily remove these shareable links?
Yeah, PowerShell and code can do both of those things. It takes longer for me to write the code to show it. So like maybe if that's an interest, we can try and get a sample or something together. But yeah, there's multiple ways to essentially gather all that. What these tools do isn't just retrieve that data, but they make like that management around that data a lot easier, right? The actioning of what you want to do easier without code. But yeah, with code, whether it's PowerShell or Graph API calls or a variety of other things, there's ways to get what you're saying. You just enumerate through things. Anyways, there's a pathway to doing what you're describing. That's correct.
Perfect.
But no out of the box. Like, sorry, if you're saying like just go to like an admin center and click a button.
Point to it.
Yeah. It doesn't aggregate it. That's the problem. So you could probably get it at like a site level through some Kludgy out of the box experiences, but the idea of aggregating that and then being able to like parse that data and stuff like that requires third party or custom. Custom being like PowerShell doesn't need to be like full scripting, traditional code, that sort of thing.
Cool. All right. This one is a longer question, so hang on tight. We are deploying teams within our unit, which is part of a large university, across 20+ committees. I am re-architecting our environment, presently a single site collection, to utilize hub functionality and associated each other committees, which will have a designated team. Sorry. Some unit leaders who aren't members of all committees and have no desire to be a member of the team desire the ability to review committee files. Will it be possible to add additional Azure AD security groups to grant access to the team's SharePoint sites? I think this is pretty similar to the first question.
So I think this is an interesting discussion, because let's talk about IA patterns just briefly. Quick digression. So shared channels, connected teams, I think they're called shared channels. That's the official name still. Shared channels is a really powerful tool that I think people underestimate the value of, and it could potentially service some of these scenarios you're describing, right? Without giving you Teams access, but this channels where we put that kind of content that's shared, with these types of individuals, and maybe that content is even shared across teams and so on and so forth, right? So, I think shared channels is certainly something that might fit into this strategy that could be very, very helpful. And then, of course, there are a variety of ways to potentially automate the addition of access, or to handle, you can obviously use out-of-the-box methods for actioning. One other thing, I know this isn't really related to this question, but it's just a feature that I think people underestimate, and most people don't know about, is you can tag. So what I mean by that, it's a fancy way of saying I can @mention a person, but I can also kind of @mention a group of people. within a team. So maybe one of the problems is if your concern isn't that you don't, access isn't the issue. You give them access, you're worried about like noise and things like that. You can always use tags as an example to notify them when something's actually applicable to them, and essentially say never look at here unless you see the app mention. So there's this concept of Teams tags. That's a effective way to communicate. And if you've never used it, maybe a cool technique for you yourself to explore with larger teams where it's really helpful to be able to like kind of reference a number of people or message a group of people.
Cool, perfect. Next question from Dave. I removed all my teams and their sites and created team sites without Office 365 groups and disabled sharing. I work in healthcare and users access and data leaks is a concern. Is this a bad approach?
I think so I could see a scenario where what was described is best because your organization isn't, they don't have an understanding or readiness around teams, right? I think would probably be the only reason I could see that being a path forward. But even then, it's a temporary state. Like the goal is not to do that. Teams is compliant. Teams provides the security patterns that you want to establish. Teams does have a general preference and basically a dependency on a simplified baseline model of permissions, right? Owners and members, not visitors versus members, right? So unless there's a scenario where you have like a visitor member differentiation, I don't think SharePoint should be the primary permission structure. Again, accepting, specialized scenarios for sharing and stuff that shared channels and stuff doesn't meet, or private channels doesn't. So my general rule of thumb is simple. It's if you have visitors and you have members and you have that kind of complexity for permissions, right? Or, people who can't delete, whatever, SharePoint's your way to go, right? And then maybe that does create a concern around dependencies on teams, the experience impact, et cetera. Again, fundamentally, I think you should still connect it to teams, but that's a different discussion. And then on the team side, the only times I see is when you do exceptions, always try and use the out-of-the-box core tools like share channels and private channels first. If that doesn't quite meet your permissions, then make the exception on the SharePoint side. But you really want to avoid that disconnect because you have to pay that tax someday. So even if you don't pay it now, at some point you're going to have to reconcile these patterns. And I think it's pretty safe to say that behavioral science-wise and everything else, the simplified teams permission model is really easy for people to understand. It works really well, and generally that's more secure because something that people understand means that they're not going to mistakenly overshare. What you find is when you lock it down the way that was described, you actually see people working around it, putting it in Dropbox, OneDrive, other places where they share it, and that's way worse, right? It's much worse than having the audit information and everything that it was leaked or exposed from this space, and then being able to secure the space. Again, it's much easier to secure a collection or container and monitor and manage that than it is to have a distribution issue. And so, yeah, over security 100% will lead. Over security engineering absolutely leads to people often exposing more risk when it's not in line with employee expectations or needs. And that sounds to me, to be honest, what's happening in your particular organization. And so maybe, I'd be happy to spend as many hours as it takes to communicate why Teams is secure and help your organizational leadership understand that so that maybe you can connect those dots more.
Cool, wonderful. One quick comment from Bruce before we move on to the next question. So Bruce said, this session was the best ever in showing the problem and solution in Microsoft 365 governance. So kudos to you, Richard. People seem to really have appreciated the presentation. On to the next question. Is Richard's, and maybe I missed that. I was busy answering some questions, so I apologize if I missed that. But is Richard's presentation taking into account the connected templates that Microsoft is rolling out?
Yeah, so I was actually, based on time, I skipped over that. When I was talking about roadmaps, I was going to talk about that. So First, let me be clear. I am very happy with connected templates. I think it's a really good progression. It's a really good state in that we're moving forward, right? When you create these spaces, having the ability to create one basically connected template is really powerful. It helps a lot with provisioning. It makes the API calls more performant. There's a whole lot of reasons why this is nice. So I really like that they're thinking about that. What is the connected experience? Like, what do we think about? What's the templating aspects where if you add it here, we could also add it to the SharePoint side, like an app as an example, things that aren't quite there yet, but that they're thinking about. Again, really, really powerful. So where connected, I think, really starts to have more impact over time is as SharePoint itself is re-engineered, to be frank. So teams, I can't break NDA. So let me say this. Teams will evolve from a UX and pattern perspective. I don't think this is surprising anyone. It will evolve slowly, just like Outlook does, but it has to evolve, right? The UX in Teams has real problems today. A really simple one that I believe should be resolved is when you add an app, like a tab, you don't know if it's a related resource or an actual app. Like there's an app integrated experience, or is it just like I'm bookmarking basically something so people can quickly link to it. And another simple example of this disconnect is when you have something like I go to a team, I click that little expansion, it expands the team underneath, but I don't see things like show me all the activity across all the channels in the team, show me all the recent documents or files across that team. What you have to do to that to get some experiences like that today is you go to SharePoint, right? So there are problems in the SharePoint Teams Connect where sometimes you go to SharePoint, sometimes you go to Teams, and this is a long-winded, very careful dancing around the issue way of saying fundamentally there are integration scenarios like connected teams and more that will enrich that experience over time that Microsoft's going to improve. At least I believe that they should. And so I think it's a great signal. Functionally, connected teams is really just like a performance and an improvement thing. I don't think it's changing. Like we're still provisioning two spaces. We're still thinking about the IA, the apps, the tabs, the channel structure. You're thinking about them distinctly, to be frank. I don't think we're doing that in a paired way today. But as that journey changes over time and you see more integration between the two, we will eventually start to never talk about SharePoint and Teams separate. I really fundamentally think that'll become a more and more common pattern, at least when we talk about collaboration spaces, right? And things like that, it'll become just kind of like the connected experience that we're talking about. So huge signal and a bunch of dancing around key concepts might be helpful for you guys, but that's all I can talk about on that one probably at this time.
Wonderful. Okay, perfect. I think we have time for maybe two or three other questions. There are still some other ones that they keep coming in.
Yes.
That's a good sign. I heard, so Larry D mentions, I heard no confidential information in Teams. Is that also a best practice for SharePoint now?
Sorry, the team name. So SharePoint name, yes. Site names, team names, those types of things get exposed, especially because we have these dynamic navigation tools all over the place. Like the name of a collection shouldn't be confidential. A folder name's different, just to be clear, right? Even maybe a channel. I think channels are risky too. That's a different, more complex discussion. So channels, I'd say, is gray, but the team name and the SharePoint name should never be confidential. You can use code names. That's a really common technique that organizations use. Obviously, before HoloLens was released for Microsoft, they had they actually anyways. There's things that organizations do to protect that information and that visibility. That's what you should do there. Really, what I was just describing is I get a lot of pushback on transparency that digital spaces exist. And remember, you can always remove them from a directory, right? So you could say like, oh, it's an M&A space, whatever. You could truly just say, I don't want to risk anything, even with a code name. I don't want to have the code name be risked, right? So we're just going to keep that out of your digital workplace directory. That's fine, right? Like that's the difference of a registry versus a directory, right? But fundamentally, I do think that we should be as open as possible with that a space exists, because that helps people navigate and understand what those spaces are, the contacts. And again, a lot of times these spaces don't have descriptive names, so having good descriptions of these spaces, and more importantly, that metadata makes it really easy to understand, oh, that's what this kind of space is about, or that's what this is for. look at all of the sites in HR that don't have those people, and then, you know, message, just like I mentioned earlier, message the owners of those spaces and say, hey, we noticed these people don't have access. That could be totally by design, just making a suggestion, something to consider. That's a whole different approach to security management, because instead of attesting and, you know, asking people later to review security, you're actually helping them. In many cases, say, like, here's people that maybe should have access. A proactive and supportive approach like that is really powerful. Almost impossible to do these types of things I'm describing without metadata about these spaces, right? Because you're just looking at algorithmically memberships of spaces is rife with risk, but being able to do it with context, right? Context is king. Then that can lead to a lot more experience improvements. So, so the name of a space really, I also see people overusing the name, where they put, like, you know, all sorts of metadata in the name. And, you know, I get it, like the out of the box Teams experiences, when you go to do search in Teams, like the UX in Teams benefits from that. But, you know, be careful with trying to cram everything in the name, because then you start to use acronyms and short forms, and it basically leads to the name of the team being confusing as heck when you get no email notifications and a bunch of other things. So there's a balancing act for sure that you want to do there, and metadata enables you to have that set of experiences where you want that detail, whereas maybe the core experiences you want to simplify, right? So it's easier for people to just be able to immediately go, oh yeah, that's that space, I know what that is, as an example.
Right. On to the next one. My IT security and compliance departments are terrified of enabling external collaboration in SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams. How can I address their fears without crippling the platform?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time in this. I'm very contrarian to some of my CSO counterparts, but in an educated and respectful way. And so, you know, we just have to be realistic about what happens when we take a certain action. There's always consequences, right? So before, in the before days, most people were in a physical environment to work, and we had firewalls, and we had firewall logs. And so if you don't know this, when you're in your network and as an employee in an organization, we would actually be able to track things like, oh, you used Box, Dropbox, you used Google Drive, you used whatever, and how much data you transferred over to it, and a bunch of other data. That data is in the firewall logs. There's tooling, I think it's free actually for Microsoft. Sorry, it might be like part of Cloud App Security or whatever for licensing. But essentially what you do is you go to, you upload those firewall logs. They still have this capability. I want to be clear. It's there. It's available for you. You upload your firewall logs, and then Microsoft inspects it and then shows you literally all the non-Microsoft technologies, Box, whatever, and how much, where it's distributed, like all sorts of information about that. So the first comment I have is, I have a lot of customers who say, well, you know, we don't have that. And I say, prove it, at least with the people that are on-prem, right, that are still going to your physical environment to work, or if they're using VPN or something. Prove, right, that you're doing that. So we go and we look at those logs and we go, no, I've never not had it. No, there's tons of data that's going to these other systems and places. And so we say, hey, if you don't enable a much more secure, auditable, highly compliant, you know, AI-enriched security graph, AI-enriched compliance graph solution like Microsoft 365, you are absolutely not being responsible as an IT leader. Period. Sorry, it's true. There's no equivalent, and I'm not just being biased because I love Microsoft. I'm telling you, there is no equivalent in the marketplace when it comes to security. That's at the baseline. The baseline doesn't use SharePoint, doesn't use, you know, these tools. Yes, there's things you can do on top of it with third parties, but at the end of the day, the most secure platform for compliance, for security, is going to be typically something that is used by more people and uses AI and algorithmic models like this. So generally speaking, there's a scale difference that Microsoft has that other spaces don't have. And it's not offense to Box and others. I know they have a security strategy, they're working hard on it, but there's a scale difference between the two of them that is insurmountable, in my opinion, today. You know, 3,000 plus people working in security in Microsoft every day, securing your content, protecting from threats. There's not the same number at Box, right? So no matter what, there's a difference in scale there, and that creates a challenge. So the second thing is, if you can't use that mechanism of saying, hey, there's this data exposure risk we already have, the other piece is to say, well, why can't some people do it? Because it's fine to say, we don't want to do that for everyone because we don't trust everyone. And I'm fine with that, right? Like, hey, maybe for a variety of reasons, you don't trust everyone, and maybe that's the responsible thing for you as an organization to do. But is that true for subset of people that have been trained to understand it, etc. No, then let's at least have that as an option, a secure, effective, governed option for those people. And then what we'll do is we'll scale from there. One last comment on this, because I really like this question. So one of the other problems is funding it. And I get that. I see a lot of customers who say, governance and security and maybe adoption are the hardest things to fund, right? Because we have projects and we do, this IT project, we do these things, but we fight fires, we do all these things, but we don't really have the money to spend on those things. So for that, there's no easy answer. The simplest approach is basically to expose the cost for that. So I really like this analogy of an insurance company. When you drive recklessly, or if you want to buy a race car, you can do that, right? No one's stopping you. I mean, maybe financially you can't, but you can go do that, from an organizational perspective. And if you're paying insurance, your premium will go up, right? And so inside of companies, you can use funny money. It doesn't need to be real, cost revenue transfer stuff, but you can basically say, look, your department uses Box and these other tools. As IT, we are responsible for ensuring security, compliance, and everything else. So we inspect them, we check them, we've worked with them, we've connected on them, we've discovered, we've imported this data into the compliance network and capability of Microsoft 365. If you don't know you can do that, you can. You can import the data from these, and then that way e-discovery and communication compliance and all those kinds of capabilities are available to you, even with these third-party tools. So to essentially have that strategy, and that's a cost to IT. You're not saying it's your cost, but you're exposing it. So now on those executive steering meetings, when people talk about costs and IT is talking about the roadmap, they can say, here's the costs for these departments, and they'll have line items there that are basically because of these unsanctioned, or whatever you want to call them, third-party tools and things like that. And so you can create visibility, which creates pressure, or literally revenue cost transfers, which is even better, which creates financial pressure for an incentive for them to be like, hey, maybe we should use these integrated, better employee experience tools that provide a richer and more compliant, compliant collaboration by design, right? And that is something that Microsoft does, bar none. It's the best in the industry. So in that way, we can use techniques like that maybe to expose and surface the funding support and prioritization we are missing that enables, that other answer to that real question that we were trying to solve in the beginning of that little digression that I did. So I'm hoping some of those ideas help other people, but yeah, I have strong opinions on this, and I'm happy to share that with any executive who listens, or I can pull in lots of other industry experts that are like me to do the same thing. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. Love the detailed answer. We can definitely feel the we hear the dedication and passion, and I love it. I really love it. I think we're gonna have to cut it short. Unfortunately, there's still a few questions, but we'll sync with Richard after, and we'll make sure that we get those answers to you. So keep an eye in the email that will follow in the next days. I think we have time for one last question, but yeah, we want to make sure that everyone gets their answers. So keep an eye open. But unfortunately, like yourselves, we're sure you have some other places to be. So unfortunately, we'll have to cut the Q&A a bit short. All right. So one question. Okay, so how about this one? Okay, so in an environment where teams are centrally managed, is it possible to set an administrative group as team owner? In this way, the office that handles all team requests would be administrator of all the teams that need to be handled.
Yes. Yeah. There's a pathway to do what you're describing. Basically out of the box. It's a little bit advanced, but yes, you can do that. And then, of course, anything is possible the second you start to add code or third parties to do some of those things to more programmatically handle it. Especially if there's exception rules, things like that. One of the biggest issues with the out of the box method for some of these things is making sure that there's visibility that you've done that. So, of course, the team owner themselves can see who the other owners are, et cetera. So there's that exposure. But what I'm more describing is if you use an AD group or assignment or things like that, keep in mind that, there's not always clarity on why that group or those people have access. So security reviews and other things can create questions. You can create more work for yourself. So, just be sure to find a method or a way to communicate that is an expectation and a pattern, and also evaluate if that should ever, have exceptions or changes, that sort of thing. Because we have seen examples where customers have done that not as targeted. I think this was a good question framing because they talked about targeting it, but someone created an M&A space. I won't say who this customer is, and then certain people had access automatically because they didn't know better, and then this created some, though it was highly confidential and all these other triggers, and so that's a thing to think about. The other concept is you can also use service accounts where you very carefully control access, which is a common pattern that I've seen customers use. So what you do is you don't add like a named person, which is probably a better solution long term if people rotate and things like that. You essentially have an account. That account's highly audited, and you don't, essentially you don't provide a password except on request through a form, and then they get that password, and then it rotates automatically after a time period, like 15 minutes, and then they can no longer use that account to access it, and then you can rotate the MFA and a bunch of other things as well. So there's methods that people can do to secure it in those types of models as well, which might be something else to consider. Again, semi out of the box, but ways to take it a little bit further. Thanks so much, Laurent, and everyone else who's asked questions. I see them all. I'm so excited after this call's done to dive into some of these. But again, just reiterating at the beginning, I talked about being super friendly. Abuse my generosity. I would really love to have one-on-one chats with many of you, one to few, with maybe a few of your colleagues or whatever, if it helps too, to talk about, what I would do if I was in your shoes and be much more prescriptive. So thanks again, ShareGates and everyone else for giving me this chance.
Yeah, and thank you so much for participating, Richard, and being so generous with your time, with the presentation and all these detailed answers. So we're going to wrap it up for this Pass the Mic. So don't forget, look at all the resources that we've shared. We've got plenty of amazing resources from the To Lead team. So go check those out. We have the Rise Up event coming for ShareGate. We'll be talking about our roadmap, and that's pretty much it. Thanks everyone for joining, and we hope to see you next time for the next Pass the Mic. If you want to make sure to receive those emails, make sure to sign up to our newsletter. And that's it. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye everyone.